When the initial girls showed up, Caleb Morrison was already 6 feet down in the grave he'd dug for himself. With soil-stained fingers, he cleaned perspiration from his brow, while his shovel quivered in his grasp. The merciless Texas heat pounded down on his weathered features as he remained standing in the pit he'd been excavating for 3 continuous hours. At 42 years old, he believed this was his appropriate conclusion. Isolated, overlooked, interred in the same cursed terrain that had claimed all he possessed. The timber cross he'd fashioned displayed basic text. Here rests a man who surrendered. No identity required. No one remained to recall it regardless. Yet, as he lifted the shovel for another portion of crimson earth, a shadow cast over the grave rim. Then came another, followed by more. 5 tiny figures appeared outlined against the scorching afternoon heavens. Their features remained concealed, but their existence was unmistakable. Young ones, girls judging by their ripped garments and matted locks. The eldest appeared no older than 14. The smallest was merely 6. Caleb's shovel halted mid-motion. During 3 years of hermit-like existence on this deserted ranch, he'd encountered precisely no visitors. The closest settlement lay 15 miles through wilderness that could destroy a full-grown man, much less children. "Sir," the tallest girl spoke, her tone firm despite the tremor in her small frame. "We require your assistance." Caleb squinted upward at them, his thoughts struggling to comprehend what he witnessed. These weren't town children on a casual walk. Their clothing was filthy, torn as if they'd been fleeing for days. Dry blood marked the oldest girl's sleeve. The tiniest one grasped a tattered doll, with his head dangling by threads. "How in blazes did you arrive here?" he snarled, immediately regretting his language before children. "We traveled on foot," the leader stated simply. "For 2 days. 2 days through desert lacking water, shade, or compassion." Caleb felt something fracture within his chest. Something that had remained frozen solid since the day he'd laid his own family to rest. But he suppressed the emotion. He refused to care. He couldn't afford to care. He was meant to be deceased by evening. "Well, you cannot remain here," he declared, gripping the shovel more firmly. "This is private land and I'm occupied." The girl's gaze dropped to the grave, then returned to his face. She didn't pose questions. "Intelligent child. They'll murder us if we return," she said quietly. The statement struck Caleb like a blow to the stomach. Murder them. These were children, not criminals. But the terror in her voice was genuine, raw, the type of fear that came from experiencing true evil. He examined their faces more carefully. Bruises on the youngest one's arms. Cuts on another's hands that appeared defensive. These girls weren't lost. They were fleeing. "Who's attempting to kill you?" he found himself asking, though he immediately wished he hadn't. "The men from the orphanage," the leader whispered. "They believe we witnessed something we shouldn't have." Caleb's blood chilled. An orphanage. He'd heard whispers about such places. Institutions where unwanted children vanished, where money exchanged hands for reasons no decent person wanted to contemplate. The smallest girl began weeping, a sound that pierced through the desert silence like a blade. The eldest immediately knelt beside her, whispering comfort with the practiced skill of someone who'd been protecting others far longer than any child should need to. That's when Caleb noticed a dust cloud on the horizon, moving rapidly, heading straight toward his ranch. The leader girl saw it as well. Her face turned pale as bone. "They've located us," she breathed. Caleb looked at the approaching riders, then at the 5 terrified children standing beside his half-completed grave. Every instinct screamed at him to send them away, to climb back into that pit and complete what he'd begun. But something in the oldest girl's eyes, a desperate courage that reminded him of someone he'd lost long ago, made him hesitate. The dust cloud grew closer. Whatever evil these children were escaping was about to arrive at his doorstep. And suddenly Caleb Morrison had to make a choice he never thought he'd confront again. Perish as planned, or fight for something worth living for. The sound of hoofbeats echoed across the desert, growing louder by the second. Time stopped as Caleb stared at those approaching riders, his mind racing faster than the hoofbeats thundering toward them. "Enter the house," he barked at the girls, scrambling out of the grave. "Now!" But the oldest girl seized his arm, her small fingers surprisingly strong. "You don't comprehend. They possess papers. Legal documents. If they discover us here, they'll take us back and you'll be charged with kidnapping. Kidnapping. The word hit Caleb like a hammer blow. He wasn't just looking at frightened children anymore. He was staring at a legal nightmare that could destroy what little life he had remaining. Then why did you come here? He demanded. Because you're the only person for miles who isn't connected to them, she said desperately. The sheriff, the mayor, the judge, they all take money from Mr. Thornton. Thornton. Caleb knew that name. Everyone in 3 counties knew Silas Thornton, the man who owned half the territory's businesses and had his fingers in every dirty deal from cattle rustling to claim jumping. The hoofbeats were close enough now that Caleb could count them. 4 riders moving fast, but not frantically, like men confident in their authority. "What's your name?" he asked the girl quickly. "Emma. Emma Thorne." Thorne, not Thornton, but close enough to make Caleb's stomach twist. Family connection? Or just bad luck? The little ones? He gestured to the other girls huddled behind Emma. "My sisters, Mary, Beth, Lucy, and Alice." Emma's voice cracked slightly. "We're all that's left." All that's left. The words carried weight that made Caleb's chest tighten. Whatever had happened to these girls, it had taken everything else away from them. The riders were now close enough that Caleb could see their faces. Hard men with harder eyes, wearing the kind of clothes that said they had money and authority. The leader wore a deputy's badge that caught the sunlight like a thread. "All right," Caleb said, his decision crystallizing with startling clarity. "Here's what we're going to do." He grabbed a shovel and started rapidly filling the grave, his movements urgent but controlled. "Emma, take your sisters to the root cellar behind the house. There's a hidden entrance under the old wagon. Stay quiet, no matter what you hear." "What about you?" Emma whispered. "I'm going to convince them you were never here." But even as he said it, Caleb knew it wouldn't be that simple. These men didn't strike him as the type to give up easily. And if Emma was right about their connections, they had legal power backing their search. The girls disappeared around the house just as the riders crested a small hill that bordered Caleb's property. He forced himself to keep shoveling, playing the part of a man simply filling in a hole. Nothing suspicious here. The deputy pulled up about 20 feet away, close enough to talk, but far enough to draw his gun if needed. His 3 companions spread out in a loose semicircle, their horses snorting and pawing at the ground. "Afternoon," the deputy called out, his voice carrying fake politeness that fooled nobody. "I'm Deputy Marcus Webb. We're looking for some runaway children." Caleb didn't stop shoveling. "Haven't seen any children. Don't get many visitors out here." 5 girls, Webb continued, his eyes scanning the property, ages 6 to 14. They escaped from the Thornton Children's Home 2 days ago. "Like I said, haven't seen anyone." Caleb finally stopped digging and leaned on the shovel, meeting Webb's stare. "This is private property, by the way." Webb's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "We have a warrant to search any property within a 50-mile radius. These children are considered dangerous." Dangerous? 5 terrified little girls? Dangerous? The lie was so outrageous that Caleb almost laughed. But the deputy's hand resting on his gun but suggested this wasn't a joke. "Dangerous how?" Caleb asked. "They witnessed something they shouldn't have," one of the other riders said, then immediately shut up when Webb shot him a warning look. "Witness something." Emma's words echoed in Caleb's memory. "They think we saw something we shouldn't have." The pieces of a very ugly picture were starting to come together, and Caleb didn't like what he was seeing. These weren't lawmen looking for runaway orphans. These were cleanup men sent to silence witnesses. "Well," Caleb said carefully, "feel free to look around, but do it quick. I've got work to finish before dark." Webb nodded to his men, who dismounted and began searching the property. They moved with the thoroughness of experienced hunters, checking every hiding spot a child might use. Caleb continued filling the grave, each shovelful of dirt feeling heavier than the last, not because of the physical weight, but because of what it represented. He was burying his old life, the life of a man who'd given up, and with each scoop, he was committing himself to something he'd sworn never to do again: care about someone other than himself. One of the searchers emerged from behind the house, shaking his head. Webb's jaw tightened with frustration. Mighty big property for one man. Webb observed. Must get lonely. I like lonely, Caleb replied. Most folks around here know to cooperate with the law, Webb said, his tone shifting to something harder. Folks who don't cooperate sometimes find themselves facing serious charges. The threat hung in the desert air, like smoke from a brush fire. Caleb straightened up, his hand unconsciously moving closer to the pistol on his hip. That sounds almost like a threat, Deputy. Just stating facts, Webb said. Those girls are carrying stolen property. Anyone harboring them would be considered an accessory to theft. Stolen property. Another lie to add to the pile. But Caleb was beginning to understand the game. These men weren't interested in justice. They were interested in covering up whatever those girls had witnessed. The searchers finished their sweep and reported back to Webb with subtle head shakes. No sign of the children. But instead of looking relieved, Webb looked angrier. You sure you haven't seen anything unusual? He pressed. 5 girls traveling alone to the desert. That's not something a man forgets. I'm sure, Caleb said firmly. Webb studied him for a long moment, then glanced at the partially filled grave. What were you burying? Dead horse. Caleb lied smoothly. Died of colic yesterday. Funny thing to bury so close to the house. Funny thing to question a man's choices on his own property. The tension stretched between them like a rope about to snap. Webb's hand moved closer to his gun, and Caleb felt his own muscles coiling for action. But then Webb seemed to reconsider. Maybe it was a look in Caleb's eyes, the look of a man who had nothing left to lose. Maybe it was a calculation that a shootout over missing orphans might raise questions they didn't want raised. We'll be back, Webb said finally, gathering his reins. Those girls can't hide forever. And when we find them, we'll remember who helped and who didn't. The 4 men rode away, their horses kicking up dust that hung in the air like a promise of trouble to come. Caleb watched until they disappeared over the horizon, then immediately headed for the root cellar. He found the girls huddled together in the darkness, Emma's arms wrapped protectively around her younger sisters. Are they gone? Emma whispered. For now, Caleb said. But they'll be back, and next time they might bring more men. Emma's face fell. We should go. We shouldn't have come here. Now you're in danger too. Caleb looked at the 5 frightened faces staring up at him in the dim light. He thought about Webb's threats, about the legal trouble he was courting, about the simple life he'd been planning to end just an hour ago. Then he thought about what kind of men would chase children through the desert and call them dangerous. No, he said firmly, you're staying right here. But even as he said it, Caleb knew that decision would change everything, because men like Webb didn't give up. They escalated, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled across the desert sky, though there wasn't a cloud in sight. As night fell over the ranch, Caleb found himself doing something he hadn't done in 3 years, cooking for more than one person. The girls sat around his small kitchen table, their faces clean for the first time in days, but their eyes still carrying shadows too dark for children to bear. Emma kept glancing toward the windows, her body coiled with tension that reminded Caleb of a wild animal ready to bolt. Tell me what you saw, he said quietly, setting plates of beans and cornbread in front of them. Emma shook her head immediately. The less you know, the safer you are. I'm already in this, Caleb replied. Those men will be back, and when they come, I need to know what I'm up against. The youngest girl, Alice, looked up from her plate with eyes that belonged on someone much older. We saw Mr. Thornton hurt a lady. Alice, no, Emma whispered urgently. But Alice continued, her small voice steady with the terrible certainty of truth. She was screaming, and then she wasn't anymore. The words hit the kitchen like a physical blow. Caleb felt his blood turn to ice as the implication sank in. These children hadn't just witnessed abuse. They'd witnessed murder. Where did this happen? He asked carefully. In the basement of the children's home, Emma said, her voice barely audible. We were supposed to be asleep, but Alice had nightmares. We were going to get her some water when we heard. She trailed off, unable to finish. The lady was asking about missing children. Beth, about 10 years old, added quietly. She had papers. She was saying she was going to tell everyone what Mr. Thornton was doing. A journalist, Caleb realized, or maybe a government inspector. Someone asking too many questions about where the orphans were really going. That's why they want us back, Emma said. We're the only ones who saw. If we're gone, there's no witnesses. If we're gone, there's no witnesses, Caleb finished grimly. The room fell silent, except for the desert wind rattling the windows. Caleb's mind raced through the implications. These weren't just runaway orphans. They were walking death sentences. Thornton would never stop hunting them, and with his money and connections, he had resources that a lone rancher couldn't match. There's something else, Emma said hesitantly. The lady, before she died, she gave me this. She reached into her torn dress and pulled out a small leather journal, its pages yellowed and worn. She said if anything happened to her, someone needed to know the truth. Caleb took the journal with hands that weren't quite steady. He opened it to the first page and felt his world tilt on its axis. The handwriting was neat, precise, documenting names, dates, and payments, a complete record of Thornton's operation. Not just a children's home, but a network of trafficking that stretched across 3 territories. Children bought and sold like cattle. Some sent to work in mines where they died within months. Others shipped to brothels in distant cities. The youngest ones simply disappeared, their fates recorded only as special orders with astronomical payment amounts. Sweet Jesus, Caleb breathed, his hands shaking as he turned page after page of documented horror. She was going to send it to the territorial governor. Emma said, but they killed her before she could. Caleb closed the journal, his mind reeling. This wasn't just evidence of murder. It was proof of systematic evil that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. With this journal, they could destroy Thornton and everyone connected to him. But that also made it the most dangerous object in 3 territories. They know she had this? He asked. Emma nodded. They tore her room apart looking for it. That's when we knew we had to run. A new sound cut through the night, the distant rumble of multiple horses moving fast. Too many horses for a simple search party. Caleb moved to the window and felt his stomach drop. At least a dozen riders were approaching. Torches flickering in the darkness like angry stars. This wasn't a police search anymore. This was a hunting party. They brought an army, he said grimly. Emma was already gathering her sisters, her movements sharp with practiced fear. We have to go right now. But Caleb shook his head. It's too late. They've got us surrounded. Through the window, he could see riders spreading out around the property, cutting off every escape route. These men had come prepared for a siege, not a search. The cellar again? Emma asked desperately. They'll tear this place apart board by board, Caleb said. They know you're here. Mary, about 8 years old, started crying silently, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. Lucy, barely 7, clutched her broken doll tighter, as if it could protect her from what was coming. Caleb looked at the 5 terrified faces staring at him, then at the journal in his hands. Evidence that could bring down a monster, but only if it survived the night. A voice boomed across the desert, amplified by a speaking trumpet. Morrison, we know they're in there. Send them out and we'll make this easy. Easy? As if there was an easy way to hand children over to murderers. Caleb moved his gun cabinet and started loading weapons with swift, practiced movements. A rifle, his pistol, a shotgun that had belonged to his father. What are you doing? Emma whispered. What I should have done 3 years ago, Caleb said, checking the cylinder of his Colt, standing up to evil. You can't fight them all, Emma protested. There are too many. Maybe, Caleb agreed, but I'll make sure they remember this night. He handed Emma the journal. There's a loose board in the back bedroom floor. Hide this there. If something happens to me, find a way to get it to the territorial capital. The voice outside boomed again, closer now. You've got 5 minutes, Morrison. Then we're coming in. Caleb looked out the window at the ring of armed men surrounding his home. 12 against 1. Not great odds, but he'd faced worse during the war. The difference was, back then he'd been fighting for abstracts, country, honor, duty. Tonight, he was fighting for something much more powerful. Tonight, He was fighting for children who had no one else. "Get in the back room," he told the girls quietly. "Whatever you hear, don't come out until morning." Emma grabbed his sleeve. "Mr. Morrison, what you're doing? Why?" Caleb paused, thinking of his own children, lost to fever 3 years ago, of the man he'd been before grief had carved out his heart. "Because some things are worth dying for," he said, simply. Outside, the 5 minutes were up, and the first torch was already flying toward his roof. The torch hit the roof with a shower of sparks, and Caleb's world exploded into chaos. "Fire on the roof!" he shouted to the girls as he kicked out the front window and took aim at the nearest rider. His first shot dropped the man from his horse, the sound echoing across the desert like thunder. The response was immediate and devastating. Gunfire erupted from all sides, bullets splintering wood and shattering glass as the ranch house became a fortress under siege. Caleb rolled away from the window as lead projectiles tore through the air where his head had been. The smell of smoke was already creeping through the house as flames licked at the wooden shingles above. "The whole place is going to burn," he muttered, crawling to another window for a better angle. Through the chaos, he could hear Webb's voice shouting orders. "Don't kill Morrison unless you have to. We need him alive to sign a confession." A confession? They weren't just here to murder witnesses. They were here to frame him for harboring criminals. Dead heroes couldn't contradict official stories. Another volley of shots forced Caleb to duck as with splinters exploded around him. He counted muzzle flashes and calculated angles. 12 men positioned strategically around the property, with more probably watching the back routes. But these weren't soldiers. They were hired guns and corrupt lawmen, used to intimidating unarmed civilians, not fighting someone who shot back. Caleb proved that point by putting his next bullet through the shoulder of a man trying to flank the house. The wounded gunman's scream cut through the night, followed by cursing that would make a saloon blush. "Morrison," Webb's voice carried over the gunfire, "those children are criminals. You're harboring fugitives. And you're a murderer." Caleb shouted back, pumping his rifle and taking aim at another shadow. The fire above was spreading faster now, casting dancing light across the desert battlefield. Smoke poured through gaps in the ceiling, making breathing difficult and visibility worse. From the back room came the sound of coughing. The girls were trapped between armed killers outside and growing flames above. That's when Caleb realized the horrible genius of their plan. They didn't need to storm the house. They just needed to wait for the fire to drive everyone out. Then they could claim the children died in the blaze while trying to escape justice. "Emma," he called out, "the back bedroom window. Can you get open?" "It's stuck," came a reply, followed by more coughing. Caleb cursed under his breath. The house was becoming a death trap. But stepping outside meant walking into a crossfire that would cut them all down in seconds, unless he gave them something else to think about. Moving fast, Caleb grabbed a lantern and threw it against the front wall, spreading burning oil across the wooden planks. If they wanted fire, he'd give them more than they bargained for. The flames leaped higher, illuminating the entire front yard and exposing 3 gunmen who'd been using darkness for cover. Caleb's rifle spoke twice more, sending them scrambling for new positions. But the victory was costly. The increased flames meant less time before the roof collapsed, and the smoke was getting thicker by the minute. "The children are going to suffocate." Emma's voice was strained with desperation. Caleb made a decision that went against every survival instinct he had. Loading his shotgun with both barrels, he kicked open the front door and stepped onto the porch. "Here I am," he roared into the night. "Come and take me." The concentrated firepower that answered nearly tore him apart. Bullets chewed up the porch around him as he dove behind a water trough, buckshot and rifle balls turning the night into a storm of lead. But his desperate gamble worked. Every gun was now focused on him, giving the girls a chance to escape through the back. He hoped. A bullet clipped his shoulder, spinning him around and sending fire through his left arm. Another shattered the water trough, soaking him with precious liquid that steamed in the heat from the burning house. "Got him!" someone shouted triumphantly. But Caleb wasn't finished. Rolling sideways, he came up with a shotgun and caught 2 men rushing the porch in the open. Both barrels discharged in a thunderous roar that sent them tumbling backward into the dirt. The return fire was immediate and furious, forcing him to scramble behind a pile of lumber as bullets whistled past his ears. That's when he heard it, the sound that made his blood turn to ice. Alice was screaming, not the scream of fear or pain, but the shriek of a child in absolute terror. It was coming from behind the house, where the girls were supposed to be escaping. They'd been caught. We got them. Webb's voice carried clearly over the gunfire. All 5, come out, Morrison, or we start cutting throats. Caleb felt something break inside his chest. He'd failed. After everything, the fight, the fire, the desperate last stand, he'd failed to save them. You want me? He called out, his voice hoarse from smoke and rage. Let them go and I'll come out unarmed. No deal, Webb replied. You're both coming with us. But if you surrender now, maybe some of these children live to see morning. Maybe. The word carried all the cruelty of false hope. Caleb looked at his remaining ammunition. 3 bullets in the rifle, 4 in his pistol. Not enough to fight through 12 men and rescue 5 children. But maybe enough for something else. The journal. Hidden under the loose floorboard in the back room, now filling with smoke and flames. Evidence that could destroy Thornton's entire operation. If it survived the fire, if anyone ever found it. If you were Caleb, what would you do? Surrender and hope these murderers show mercy to innocent children, or make one final desperate play that could save the evidence but doom them all? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you choose, because what Caleb decided next would either redeem his soul or damn it forever. Moving with purpose born of absolute desperation, he began crawling back toward the burning house, not to surrender, but to retrieve the one thing that could make their deaths mean something. The roof creaked ominously above, ready to collapse at any moment, and somewhere in the darkness, Alice was still screaming. Caleb crawled through smoke and flames toward the back bedroom, his lungs burning with each breath as the house groaned around him like a dying beast. The floorboard was exactly where he told Emma to hide the journal, but now it was hot enough to blister skin. Using his knife, he pried it up and felt relief wash over him as his fingers closed around the leather-bound evidence. That's when he heard footsteps on the front porch. They were coming in. Through the smoke, he could see shapes moving through the doorway. 3 men with bandanas over their faces, guns drawn, searching for survivors. They moved carefully, expecting resistance, but they weren't prepared for what Caleb had planned. He stuffed the journal inside his vest and grabbed the kerosene lamp from the bedside table. The house was already burning, but what he needed was an explosion big enough to scatter their attackers and create chaos. Moving quietly to the kitchen, he found what he was looking for, his store of blasting powder, kept for clearing rocks from fields. Enough to level half the house. The footsteps were getting closer. Check the back rooms. Webb's voice carried through the smoke. Morrison's in here somewhere. Caleb poured the powder around the kitchen, creating a trail that led to the largest concentration. If he timed this right, the explosion would blow out the back wall and give him a chance to reach the girls. If he timed it wrong, he'd be scattered across 3 counties. Found something. One of the searchers called out, "Blood trail leading to the kitchen." Time was up. Caleb lit the kerosene-soaked rag. He prepared and dropped it onto the powder trail. The fire raced along the floor like a living thing, giving him maybe 10 seconds before the entire kitchen became a bomb. He dove through the window just as the explosion tore through the house. The blast was devastating. The entire back wall disintegrated in a shower of wood and flame, the shockwave knocking down 2 men who'd been guarding the rear. The 3 searchers inside simply vanished in the fireball that erupted from what had been the kitchen. Caleb hit the ground hard, his ears ringing and his vision blurred from the concussion, but he was alive. And more importantly, he could see the girls. They were tied to a wagon about 50 yards away, surrounded by the remaining gunmen who were now stumbling and disoriented from the explosion. Webb was shouting orders, but his voice seemed to come from underwater. Alice was no longer screaming. She sat perfectly still, her small body rigid with terror that had gone beyond sound. That's when Caleb saw something that made his blood boil with rage. Emma's dress was torn in a way that had nothing to do with their escape attempt. Her face was bruised, and she held herself with the careful posture of someone trying to hide fresh pain. They'd hurt her. These animals had put their hands on a 14-year-old girl. All thoughts of strategy and survival burn away in a furnace of pure fury. Caleb rose from the rubble like an avenging spirit, his rifle speaking death as he charged toward the wagon. His first shot took down the man closest to Emma. His second sent another gunman spinning into the dirt. The remaining men scrambled for cover, but Caleb was among them now, fighting with the savage intensity of a man who had nothing left to lose. A pistol barked to his left, the bullet creasing his ribs and spinning him around. He answered with the butt of his rifle, crushing the shooter's skull and snatching his weapon. "Kill him!" Webb screamed from behind the wagon. "Kill him now!" But Webb's men were discovering that there's a difference between murdering children and fighting a man who's already considered himself dead. Caleb fought like a demon, using every dirty trick he'd learned in 2 wars and 3 decades of frontier living. He grabbed one gunman and used him as a shield while putting a bullet through another. When his makeshift protection died, he threw the body at Webb and rolled behind a water barrel, reloading with hands that moved automatically despite the chaos. The tide was turning. What had started as 12 against 1 was now 4 against 1, and the 4 remaining men were starting to break. But breaking men were the most dangerous kind. "Enough!" Webb roared, pressing his gun against Emma's temple. "Drop your weapons, or I blow her brains out." Caleb froze, his rifle halfway to his shoulder. Through the smoke and firelight, he could see Emma's eyes, brave and defiant even with a gun to her head. "You're done, Morrison," Webb panted, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "Drop the guns, and maybe I'll make it quick." Caleb looked at the remaining 3 gunmen, all with their weapons trained on him, at the 5 girls tied to the wagon, their faces streaked with tears and soot, at Emma, who was trying to mouth something to him despite the gun against her skull. The word she was forming was clear: run. But Caleb Morrison had run from enough things in his life: his family's death, his responsibility, his chance to be the man he should have been. "You know what, Webb?" he said slowly, lowering his rifle. "You're right. I'm done." Webb smiled triumphantly, relaxing slightly. That's when Caleb pulled the hidden derringer from his boot and put both barrels through Webb's chest. The deputy's gun discharged as he fell, the bullet going wide, and chaos erupted again as the remaining gunmen opened fire. But something had changed in that moment of defiance. The girls weren't screaming anymore. They were fighting. Emma had worked one hand free and was untying her sisters. Mary and Beth were kicking at their captors. Even little Alice was biting the hand of the man trying to hold her. And Caleb Morrison was no longer the broken man who'd been digging his own grave that morning. He was something much more dangerous. He was a man with something to protect. But as he reached for Webb's fallen gun, he saw a movement in the distance that made his heart sink. More riders, at least 20 of them, coming fast from the direction of town. Thornton himself was coming to finish this personally. 20 riders thundered across the desert like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. But Caleb Morrison was no longer the same man who'd faced 12. The journal pressed against his chest like a talisman as he helped Emma cut her sisters free from a wagon. Blood streaked his face from a dozen small wounds, and his left arm hung uselessly from the shoulder wound. But his eyes burned with purpose that hadn't existed 12 hours ago. "Can you ride?" he asked Emma quickly. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite everything she'd endured. "Take the wagon, heading north toward the canyon. There's a cave about 3 miles up the ridge. You can hide there. What about you?" Mary asked, her 8-year-old voice trembling. Caleb looked at the approaching dust cloud, then at Webb's body sprawled in the dirt. The remaining 3 gunmen had scattered when the shooting started, but they'd be back with reinforcements. "I'm going to buy you time," he said, simply. Emma grabbed his arm. "You can't fight 20 men." "I don't have to fight them," Caleb replied, pulling the journal from his vest. "I just have to make sure this survives." He pressed the leather-bound evidence into Emma's hands. "Get this to the territorial capital. Find someone who can't be bought, a newspaper editor, a federal marshal, someone. They'll kill you," Emma whispered. "Maybe," Caleb admitted, "but they were going to kill me anyway. At least this way it means something." The thunder of hoofbeats was getting closer in the firelight from the burning house. Caleb could make out the lead rider, a tall man in an expensive suit riding a horse that cost more than most people made in a year. Silas Thornton, the devil himself, come to clean up his own mess. Go, Caleb urged the girls. Now. But Emma hesitated, her young face torn between survival and something that looked disturbingly like loyalty. You saved us, she said quietly. No, Caleb replied, checking his remaining ammunition. You saved me. The girls climbed into the wagon, Emma taking the reins with the